My name is Beverly Sykes, and I am 70 years old. These hands you see before you, wrinkled and weathered by time, once picked cotton under the merciless Virginia sun until my fingers bled. These eyes have witnessed horrors that would break most souls, and this heart has carried burdens no human being should ever bear. But I am still here, and this is my story, a story of 20 years in bondage, of unspeakable pain, and of a transformation that even I could scarcely have imagined. It was 1840 when I first arrived at Thornhill Plantation in Halifax County, Virginia. I was just 10 years old, torn from my mother's arms at an auction in Richmond. I remember the way she screamed my name as rough hands pulled me away, the sound echoing in my ears even now, 50 years later. The man who purchased me was Charles Thornhill, a wealthy tobacco planter whose family had owned these lands for 3 generations. He looked at me the way one might examine livestock, checking my teeth, my limbs, my potential for work. I was worth $800 to him that day. $800 for a child's entire existence. The first night at Thornhill, I cried myself to sleep on a dirt floor in the quarters, surrounded by strangers who would become my only family. An older woman named Ruth held me close and whispered that I needed to be strong, that tears were a luxury we could not afford. She taught me how to survive in a world designed to destroy us. Wake before dawn, work until your body screams for mercy, keep your eyes down, your mouth shut, and your spirit hidden deep where they cannot reach it. The plantation was vast, stretching across nearly 2,000 acres of Virginia's red clay soil. Tobacco was our master's wealth, and we were the machinery that generated it. By the time I was 12, I was working the fields alongside the adults, my small hands learning to plant, cultivate, and harvest the crop that made the Thornhill family rich while we lived on scraps and broken promises. The overseer, a cruel man named Jackson, carried a whip that he used liberally. I still bear the scars on my back from the day I stumbled in the field, too exhausted to stand. 3 lashes for being weak, he said. 3 reminders that my pain meant nothing. But I learned quickly. I learned to move faster, to anticipate orders before they were given, to make myself invisible when danger approached. I learned which overseers to avoid, which house servants might share an extra piece of bread, which hiding spots offered a few moments of peace. I learned the songs we sang in the fields, coded messages of hope and resistance disguised as spirituals. I learned that even in the darkest circumstances, human beings find ways to preserve their humanity. Master Thornhill rarely visited the fields himself. He preferred the comfort of his grand white mansion with its towering columns and manicured gardens, maintained by house servants who lived under different but equally oppressive conditions. His wife, Margaret Thornhill, was a delicate woman who prided herself on her Christian values while profiting from our suffering. She would host tea parties for the neighboring plantation owners' wives, discussing charity work and moral virtue while we toiled just beyond her parlor windows. The contradiction never seemed to trouble her conscience. As I grew into adolescence, I began to understand the additional dangers that awaited young women in bondage. Ruth warned me constantly to stay away from the master's son, William Thornhill, who had recently returned from university in Charleston. She told me stories of other girls who had caught his attention, girls who disappeared into the night or were sold away when their conditions became inconvenient. I tried to heed her warnings, but on a plantation there was nowhere to hide. I was 17 when William Thornhill first cornered me in the tobacco barn. It was late evening, and I had been sent to check on the drying leaves. He appeared in the doorway, blocking the light, and I knew immediately that my life was about to change in ways I could not control. What happened in that barn is not something I will describe in detail, for some wounds run too deep for words, and some violations deserve the privacy of silence. But I will say this: I had no choice, no voice, no power to refuse. My body was not my own. It had never been my own. The visits continued throughout that winter and into the spring. I prayed for deliverance, for escape, for anything to end the nightmare. But escape was nearly impossible. The surrounding countryside was patrolled by men on horseback who hunted runaways with dogs. The penalties for attempting to flee were severe: public whippings, brandings, or worse. I had seen a man beaten nearly to death for trying to reach his wife on a neighboring plantation. I knew the odds were against me, By summer, I realized I was carrying William Thornhill's child. The discovery filled me with a complex mixture of emotions I still struggle to articulate. Terror, certainly, for what this meant for my future. Despair at bringing a child into this brutal world. But also, strangely, a fierce determination to protect this life growing inside me, to ensure that my baby would somehow have a better fate than mine. Ruth prepared herbal teas to ease my morning sickness and taught me how to continue working through the pregnancy, how to hide my condition for as long as possible. When Margaret Thornhill finally noticed my swelling belly, the entire household erupted in chaos. She confronted her son in a rage, and their argument could be heard throughout the plantation. William denied responsibility at first, but eventually admitted the truth. Charles Thornhill, pragmatic as always, saw an opportunity rather than a scandal. He separated me from the other enslaved people, moving me to a small cabin behind the main house. The improved conditions came with expectations. I would bear the child, and then decisions would be made about both our futures. I gave birth to my son on a cold November morning in 1857. The pain was excruciating, and I was attended only by Ruth and another midwife named Clara. But when I held that baby in my arms for the first time, something shifted in my spirit. He was beautiful, with light brown skin that marked him as mixed, evidence of the violence that created him, but also a human being deserving of love and protection. I named him Samuel, after my own father, whom I barely remembered. Master Charles came to see the baby the next day. He studied Samuel with the same appraising look he had given me 17 years earlier. Then he made an announcement that would change everything. Samuel would be raised in the main house as William's acknowledged son, given education and opportunities. And I, as his mother, would be moved to a position managing the household staff. It was not freedom, but it was power. Small, conditional, but real. The years following Samuel's birth were a study in contradictions. I was still enslaved, still property in the eyes of the law, still subject to the whims of the Thornhill family. But my position had shifted in subtle yet significant ways. I was no longer just another field hand whose life could be discarded without consequence. I was the mother of Charles Thornhill's grandson, a fact that afforded me a degree of protection I had never known before. My new role as household manager placed me in direct contact with the inner workings of the plantation. I oversaw the house servants, managed supplies and provisions, and gradually became privy to the family's business discussions. Charles Thornhill, despite his many faults, recognized competence when he saw it. I had a sharp mind for numbers and organization, skills I had deliberately hidden during my years in the fields. Now I began to reveal them strategically. Samuel grew up in a strange liminal space, neither fully white nor treated as enslaved. He took lessons with a tutor alongside the Thornhill children, learned to read and write with a proficiency that filled me with pride and terror. Every accomplishment was a victory, but also a reminder of how precarious our situation remained. William Thornhill showed minimal interest in his son, viewing Samuel as an embarrassing mistake rather than a beloved child. But Charles had different plans. He saw in Samuel a potential heir, someone who could continue the family business even as his legitimate grandchildren showed little aptitude for plantation management. I watched and learned everything I could. When Charles discussed tobacco prices and market fluctuations with his associates, I listened from my position serving tea. When the plantation accountant came to review the books, I memorized the figures and calculations. When buyers came to inspect the tobacco crop, I noted their assessment criteria and pricing strategies. Knowledge became my weapon, the one thing they could not take from me. The political situation in Virginia was growing increasingly tense. It was 1858, and the debates over slavery were reaching a fever pitch. I heard the Thornhill men arguing about secession, about states' rights, about the economic necessity of maintaining the institution that held me captive. They spoke of us as if we were not human beings but investments, capital assets, whose value must be protected. The cognitive dissonance required to hold such beliefs, while I stood right there, managing their household with more skill than any of them possessed, was staggering. Ruth remained my closest confidant. Now in her 60s, she worked primarily in the kitchen, her hands too arthritic for field work. We would sit together in the early mornings before the household woke, and she would share wisdom accumulated over a lifetime of survival. She taught me to recognize opportunity when it appeared, to position myself strategically, to play the long game. Freedom might be impossible, she said, but power came in many forms. If I could not escape the system, perhaps I could learn to manipulate it. Margaret Thornhill's health began to decline in 1859. She developed a persistent cough that worsened throughout the winter, and by spring, she was bedridden. I tended to her personally, preparing her medicines, managing her care, sitting with her during the long nights when fever gripped her. In her delirium, she sometimes forgot who I was, calling me by her sister's name, thanking me for kindnesses I had never shown. Other times, she would look at me with full awareness and something like guilt in her eyes, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. She died in May, clutching my hand, whispering apologies I could not fully accept, but acknowledged nonetheless. Her death shifted the household dynamics once again. Charles, now alone, relied on me even more heavily. I managed not just the house servants, but began overseeing aspects of the plantation operations. I worked with the overseer to plan crop rotations, managed the distribution of supplies, kept detailed records of expenditures and income. Charles trusted my judgment in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. I was still enslaved, but I was also indispensable. Samuel, now nearly 3 years old, was growing into a clever, observant child. He followed me everywhere when I was not working, asking endless questions about the world around him. I taught him to see beyond the surfaces, to understand that the elegant mansion we lived in was built on suffering, that his privilege came at others' expense. I wanted him to know the truth of where he came from, even as I prepared him for the complex future ahead. The outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861 sent shockwaves through Virginia. Charles Thornhill, too old to fight himself, sent his sons to join the Confederate Army. William left with grand speeches about honor and defending our way of life, never once acknowledging the irony of his words spoken in my presence. The plantation's operations fell increasingly to me and the overseer, a man named Davis who had replaced the brutal Jackson the previous year. Davis was not kind. Kindness was not possible in his position, but he was practical and recognized that cooperation yielded better results than constant violence. As the war progressed and Confederate fortunes fluctuated, the plantation's profitability became precarious. Trade routes were disrupted, currency became unstable, and labor was increasingly difficult to manage as whispers of emancipation spread through the enslaved community. I saw the fear in Charles Thornhill's eyes as his world began to crumble. The system that had made him wealthy was collapsing, and he was too old and too invested in the old ways to adapt. I began to make my own plans. I had been keeping careful mental records of the plantation's assets, debts, and value. I knew which parcels of land were most productive, which equipment needed replacement, which business relationships were most crucial. I also knew that Charles was accumulating debt to maintain his lifestyle as war expenses mounted. He borrowed against future tobacco crops, against the land itself, against a future that looked increasingly uncertain. In the winter of 1862, Charles suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. I became, in essence, the acting manager of Thornhill Plantation. I made decisions about planting and harvesting, negotiated with suppliers, managed the finances. The white neighbors and business associates were scandalized. A black woman, still enslaved, running a major plantation. But necessity overcame their prejudices. I kept the operation profitable when so many others were failing, and profit spoke louder than racial ideology. Samuel was now 5, reading at a level beyond his years, asking questions about the war, about slavery, about his place in the world. I told him that change was coming, that the world he was born into would not be the world he grew up in. I taught him to be patient, to be observant, to prepare himself for opportunities that might arise from chaos. I taught him that survival sometimes required strategy more than strength. News of the Emancipation Proclamation reached us in early 1863. It did not immediately affect our situation. Virginia was Confederate territory, beyond Lincoln's authority to enforce such a decree. But the symbolic power was immense. I watched the other enslaved people on the plantation process this information, saw hope kindle in eyes that had been dead for years. Ruth wept openly, saying she had lived long enough to see the beginning of the end. But I knew the reality was more complicated. Even if the Confederacy lost, even if slavery was abolished, we would still face a world built on centuries of racial oppression. Freedom on paper would not translate automatically into safety, prosperity, or justice. I needed to ensure that when that moment came, I had positioned myself and my son for not just survival, but success. The plantation was failing, Charles was dying, and his legitimate heirs were either dead on battlefields or had fled to safer territories. An opportunity was forming, one that required perfect timing and flawless execution. By 1863, the Civil War had transformed Virginia into a landscape of destruction and desperation. Thornhill Plantation, once a symbol of Southern prosperity, now struggled to maintain basic operations. The fields that had produced premium tobacco were partially abandoned, with insufficient labor and resources to cultivate them properly. The grand mansion showed signs of neglect, paint peeling from the columns, gardens overgrown with weeds. Charles Thornhill, confined to his bed and barely able to communicate, watched his legacy crumble around him. I had become the plantation's de facto authority, though I held no legal status beyond that of enslaved property. I made every decision from crop selection to financial negotiations, managed every aspect of the operation with meticulous care. The remaining white staff, the overseer, the accountant, a few administrators, followed my instructions because I was the only person who understood the complete picture of the plantation's operations. The situation was absurd and fragile, a temporary arrangement that existed only because the traditional power structure had collapsed. The enslaved community at Thornhill had dwindled significantly. Some people had fled toward Union lines when federal troops came within 20 miles of the plantation. Others had been sold off in the early war years when Charles needed cash to pay debts. Of the 60 people who had been here when the war started, fewer than 30 remained. Those who stayed did so for various reasons: fear of the unknown, family ties, age or infirmity that made escape dangerous, or because they, like me, sensed that staying might offer opportunities that flight could not. Ruth, now 72 and increasingly frail, spent most of her time in the kitchen where she had worked for over 50 years. She watched my maneuverings with knowing eyes, occasionally offering cryptic advice. "You're playing a dangerous game, child," she told me one morning as I reviewed the plantation's financial records. "But sometimes the only way out is through." She understood what I was attempting, the careful positioning that might allow me to claim something that should have been impossible. Samuel was 6 years old and frighteningly intelligent. He could read better than most adults, white or black, and had developed a precocious understanding of mathematics and business principles. I tutored him myself now, teaching him everything I knew about running a plantation, managing finances, negotiating contracts. He asked me once why I was teaching him these things when we were still enslaved. I told him that circumstances were about to change, and he needed to be ready. The look in his eyes told me he understood more than his years should allow. The turning point came in the autumn of 1863. The plantation's largest creditor, a bank in Richmond, sent representatives to assess Charles Thornhill's ability to repay his substantial loans. The debt had ballooned to nearly $40,000, secured against the plantation's land and assets. With tobacco production at a fraction of pre-war levels and Confederate currency becoming worthless, default seemed inevitable. The bank representatives were prepared to foreclose and liquidate the property. I met with them in Charles's study, presenting detailed records I had maintained of every transaction, every expense, every revenue stream. I showed them that under my management, the plantation had remained marginally profitable, even as neighbors failed completely. I demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of the property's value, the market conditions, the realistic prospects for recovery once the war ended. They were skeptical at first. How could an enslaved woman possess such expertise? But the numbers spoke for themselves. Then I made my proposal, a plan I had been developing for months. I would assume personal responsibility for the debt in exchange for eventual ownership of the plantation. I had saved a small amount of money from selling vegetables and preserving foods for other households, barely $200, which I offered as initial payment. The rest would be paid from the plantation's future revenues under my continued management. It was an audacious, almost absurd proposition. Enslaved people could not own property, could not enter into legal contracts, could not function as independent economic actors. But we were living in extraordinary times. The bank representatives consulted with their superiors in Richmond. The Confederate government was crumbling. Federal victory seemed increasingly likely, and the entire social and economic system was in flux. Traditional rules were becoming meaningless. What mattered was securing some return on their investment rather than losing everything to war or emancipation. After 2 weeks of negotiation, they agreed in principle, pending the war's outcome and subsequent legal clarifications regarding property rights and formerly enslaved people. Charles Thornhill died in December 1863, unable to speak, but aware enough to understand what was happening. I sat with him in his final hours, this man whose family had owned me, whose son had violated me, whose grandson I was raising. I felt no satisfaction in his decline, no joy in outlasting him. I felt only the weight of history and the responsibility of what came next. He died looking at me with an expression I could not decipher. Regret, perhaps, or simply incomprehension that the world had changed so completely. William Thornhill returned briefly for his father's funeral, wounded and bitter from battles in Tennessee. He was shocked to discover the plantation's financial situation and my role in managing it. We had a confrontation in the study, where he shouted about betrayal and uppity behavior, about knowing my place and the natural order of things. I listened silently until he exhausted himself, then explained the reality. The plantation was deeply indebted, his father had mortgaged everything, and the only thing preventing complete foreclosure was my agreement with the creditors. He could contest it, of course, but doing so would likely result in total loss. He left the next day, returning to his regiment, and I never saw him again. I heard later that he died at Petersburg in 1864. The final year of the war was the hardest. Resources became desperately scarce, Confederate money worthless, trade networks completely disrupted. We survived by returning to subsistence agriculture, growing food for ourselves, and trading surplus with neighbors. I bartered my management expertise, helping other failing plantations reorganize their operations in exchange for supplies and equipment. I built relationships with local merchants and farmers, establishing myself as a reliable, competent business operator regardless of my legal status. When news of Lee's surrender reached us in April 1865, the entire community gathered in the plantation's central yard. I stood before the people who had been enslaved alongside me for 25 years and spoke words I had never imagined I would say. We are free. As of today, you are all free people. The silence was profound, broken by Ruth's sobbing, and then by a wave of emotion that swept through us all. Joy, disbelief, fear, hope, all mixed together in a moment that defied description. But freedom brought immediate practical questions. Where would people go? How would they survive? What did freedom actually mean in a devastated landscape with no resources or infrastructure? I made an offer. Anyone who wanted to stay could remain on the plantation as paid workers. I could not pay much. The plantation was still deeply indebted, but I could offer food, shelter, and a share in future profits. About half the people chose to stay, including Ruth. The others departed to search for lost family members or to try their fortunes elsewhere. I wished them well and sent them off with what provisions I could spare. The legal complications of my situation took years to resolve. The Reconstruction government eventually recognized my contract with the Richmond Bank, though the details were contested repeatedly in courts. I had to prove my competence, my financial stability, my ability to manage the property. I faced opposition from white neighbors who found my ownership offensive, from former Confederate sympathizers who wanted to restore the old order, from carpetbaggers who saw the plantation as an opportunity for exploitation. I fought them all with documents, with lawyers I could barely afford, with the testimony of business associates who vouched for my capability. Samuel, now 8 years old, attended the newly established Freedmen's Schools and then an academy for advanced students in Richmond. I invested in his education as my highest priority, knowing that his future depended on knowledge and credentials that could not be taken away. He was brilliant and driven, understanding that he represented not just himself, but possibilities for our entire community. The years following emancipation tested everything I had learned about survival, strategy, and resilience. Thornhill Plantation, which I began privately thinking of as Sykes Plantation, though the legal name change would not come for several more years, operated in a state of constant precariousness. I managed the property with a workforce of free laborers, former enslaved people who now received wages and a share of profits. It was a revolutionary concept that attracted both curiosity and hostility from neighboring landowners still clinging to exploitative labor practices. Reconstruction Virginia was a chaotic landscape of opportunity and danger. The old plantation aristocracy resisted the new social order with every tool at their disposal: legal challenges, economic sabotage, and outright violence. The Ku Klux Klan and similar groups terrorized black landowners and entrepreneurs, trying to intimidate us back into subservience. I faced threats, vandalism, and multiple attempts to force me off the property. I armed the workers who stayed with me, established watch rotations, and built alliances with other black landowners and sympathetic white neighbors for mutual protection. The Richmond Bank that held the plantation's debt initially doubted my ability to make payments. I proved them wrong through sheer determination and innovative management. I diversified beyond tobacco, planting food crops that could be sold to the growing urban markets in Richmond and Petersburg. I established contracts with Freedmen's Bureau to supply provisions for schools and relief programs. I negotiated favorable terms with northern merchants eager to do business in the recovering South. Every dollar earned went toward debt payments, operational expenses, and gradual improvements to the property. Ruth remained my closest advisor until her death in 1868. She was 77 years old and had lived to see not just emancipation, but my transformation into a property owner and businesswoman. In her final days, lying in a bed in the cottage I had built for her, she took my hand and said, "You did what I never imagined possible, child. You turned all that suffering into something that matters." Her funeral was attended by over 100 people, formerly enslaved individuals from surrounding counties who came to honor a woman who had helped so many survive the worst of times. Samuel flourished in his studies, eventually attending Howard University in Washington, D.C., one of the first historically black universities established after the war. He studied law and business, preparing himself to take over the plantation's operations eventually. During his school breaks, he returned home to work alongside me, learning the practical aspects of management that complemented his theoretical education. By the time he was 20, he was handling complex negotiations and legal matters with a sophistication that amazed me. The financial turning point came in 1872. I had been making steady payments on the debt for 7 years, but the principal remained substantial. Then Samuel, now practicing law, discovered an irregularity in the original loan documents. Charles Thornhill had been charged usurious interest rates that violated Virginia law, even under the Confederate government. We challenged the debt calculation in court, and after 18 months of litigation, won a judgment reducing the total amount owed by nearly 40%. The remaining balance was restructured on favorable terms, finally putting full ownership within realistic reach. By 1875, I owned Thornhill Plantation outright. The final debt payment was a moment of profound emotion. I was 55 years old, 35 years after first arriving on this land as a terrified 10-year-old girl in chains. The property that had been my prison was now my possession, purchased through blood, tears, and relentless determination. I legally changed the name to Sykes Plantation and had a new sign created for the entrance road. Every time I passed that sign, I felt a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in what I had achieved, sorrow for all those who had suffered and died to make the plantation profitable for the Thornhill family. The plantation thrived under my ownership in ways it never had under the Thornhills. Free labor proved more productive than enslaved labor, a fact that contradicted everything the old masters had claimed about the necessity of bondage. Workers who had a stake in their success, who earned fair wages and were treated with respect, produced better quality crops and took pride in their work. We became known for agricultural innovation, implementing crop rotation techniques and soil conservation practices that increased yields while preserving the land's fertility. I employed dozens of people, all free workers earning competitive wages. I established a school on the plantation for workers' children, hiring teachers to provide education that would give the next generation opportunities my generation never had. I built decent housing, provided medical care, created a community that stood in stark contrast to the brutal oppression that had characterized the plantation's previous existence. It was not perfect. Economic pressures and social realities limited what I could achieve, but it was a fundamental transformation. My success attracted attention, not all of it welcome. Northern newspapers wrote articles about the formerly enslaved woman who became a wealthy landowner, portraying me as an inspirational figure. Southern whites viewed me with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. Other Black entrepreneurs sought my advice on business strategies and managing racial hostility. I became an unofficial advisor to the Freedmen's Bureau, helping design agricultural programs and economic development initiatives. I testified before state legislative committees about labor practices and property rights. I used my voice and my example to argue for justice and equality, knowing that every success demonstrated the lie of racial inferiority. But I never forgot the cost. I walked fields where I had once picked tobacco until my hands bled, where I had been whipped for moving too slowly, where I had watched friends and family suffer and die. I slept in the mansion where I had been assaulted, where I had served people who considered me property, where I had plotted my unlikely rise. The weight of history was inescapable, a constant presence that shaped everything I did. Samuel married in 1876, choosing a brilliant young woman named Caroline, who had graduated from the Oberlin College in Ohio. Their wedding on the plantation was a celebration that brought together a remarkable community. Formerly enslaved people who had survived the worst of human cruelty, white allies who had supported Reconstruction, Black professionals and entrepreneurs building new lives in freedom. It was a defiant assertion of our humanity and our right to joy, despite everything the world had tried to do to us. When Samuel and Caroline's first child was born in 1877, I held my grandson and wept. This child would never know slavery, would never be bought or sold, would grow up on land his family owned rather than served. He would face racism and discrimination. Those evils would not disappear quickly, but he would face them as a free person with resources and education, with a family history of resistance and triumph. I named him Charles, reclaiming that name from the man who had owned me, transforming it into something that belonged to us. By 1880, I was 60 years old and had spent half my life in slavery, half in freedom. The contrast between these two halves was so stark that sometimes I struggled to believe they belonged to the same existence. Sykes Plantation had become one of the most successful agricultural operations in Halifax County, worth an estimated $150,000, a fortune that would have been unimaginable to the young girl dragged to this place in chains 40 years earlier. The plantation now spanned just over 1,000 acres. I had sold some of the original property to other Black farmers, believing that spreading ownership and opportunity served the community better than accumulating maximum personal wealth. The main crops were still tobacco and cotton, but we also cultivated wheat, corn, and vegetables for local markets. I had invested in modern equipment, making the operation more efficient and less dependent on backbreaking manual labor. I employed over 70 people during peak seasons, paying fair wages that attracted the best workers in the region. Samuel had taken over day-to-day management of the plantation, bringing his legal expertise and business education to bear on every decision. He negotiated contracts with northern textile mills, arranged favorable transportation rates with railroad companies, and fought discriminatory business practices through legal channels. Together, we had built an enterprise that proved Black people were fully capable of succeeding in complex business operations when given the opportunity. Our success was a political statement as much as an economic achievement. But Reconstruction was ending, and the white backlash against Black progress was intensifying. The Compromise of 1877 had withdrawn federal troops from the South, leaving Black communities vulnerable to the restored white power structure. Across Virginia and the broader South, discriminatory laws were being enacted to strip away voting rights, enforce segregation, and restore white supremacy through legal rather than explicitly violent means, though violence remained ever present as well. I faced increasing harassment from white neighbors and local authorities who resented my success. Property tax assessments on the plantation were arbitrarily increased, far beyond those imposed on comparable white-owned properties. Local banks refused to extend credit for expansion projects. Suppliers charged higher prices and demanded stricter payment terms. Samuel fought these injustices in court when possible, winning some battles but losing others to judges determined to uphold racial hierarchies. The social isolation was particularly difficult. White society excluded me completely, of course, but I also existed in a strange space within the Black community. My wealth and status created distance from people who had been my peers in slavery. Some resented my success, viewing it as collaboration with the oppressive system. Others put me on a pedestal, expecting me to solve problems beyond my capacity to address. I navigated these dynamics carefully, trying to use my resources to support community needs, funding schools, helping families in crisis, creating employment opportunities, while acknowledging that my individual success could not substitute for systemic change. Caroline, Samuel's wife, became my closest companion during these years. She was brilliant and compassionate, with a fierce commitment to education and racial uplift. She established a library on the plantation, collecting books that workers and their families could borrow. She organized literacy classes for adults who had been denied education during slavery. She corresponded with Black women intellectuals and activists across the country, building networks of resistance and mutual support. Her presence reminded me that the struggle for justice required not just economic success, but cultural and educational advancement as well. My grandchildren, Charles, followed by 3 more in quick succession, gave me profound joy. I watched them grow up with advantages I could scarcely have dreamed of: formal education, comfortable living conditions, loving family environments, freedom to imagine futures limited only by their talents and ambitions rather than by chains and whips. But I also worried about the world they would inherit. The rollback of Reconstruction gains suggested that the fight for equality would extend far beyond my lifetime. I began to think seriously about legacy, about how my story would be remembered and what lessons it might offer. I started writing down my experiences, filling notebooks with memories of slavery and freedom, of degradation and triumph, of all the people who had contributed to my survival and success. Samuel encouraged me to consider publishing these memoirs, arguing that my story could inspire others and document the realities of slavery and Reconstruction for future generations. I was reluctant at first. The memories were painful, and I feared judgment for choices I had made, but eventually I recognized the importance of bearing witness. In 1882, I was invited to speak at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, a school for Black students established in 1868. Standing before an auditorium of young people, I told them my story, the violence and exploitation of slavery, the complex path to freedom, the years of struggle to build something meaningful from the ruins. I told them that success required intelligence, perseverance, strategic thinking, and sometimes painful compromises. I told them that individual achievement was important, but insufficient, that real progress required collective action and systemic change. I told them never to forget where they came from or the people who paved the way for their opportunities. The speech was received with powerful emotion. Students and faculty wept openly as I described the realities of enslavement. They cheered when I recounted taking ownership of the plantation. They sat in thoughtful silence as I discussed the ongoing challenges of the post-Reconstruction era. Afterward, dozens of young people approached me with questions, seeking advice about navigating a world that valued their labor but denied their humanity. I tried to offer honest counsel, acknowledging the difficulty of the path ahead while affirming my faith in their potential. Ruth's words came back to me often during these years. "You're playing a dangerous game, child, but sometimes the only way out is through." I had played that game and won, at least by certain measures. But the larger game, the fight for full equality and justice, remained far from won. The system that had enslaved me had been legally abolished, but its legacy persisted in economic exploitation, political disenfranchisement, social segregation, and constant threats of violence. My success was real but fragile, dependent on continuous vigilance and resistance. I invested heavily in the next generation's education, funding scholarships for promising students who lacked resources to attend college. I supported Black newspapers and publications that challenged racist narratives. I contributed to legal defense funds for people facing unjust persecution. I used my economic power to create spaces of opportunity and dignity, knowing that wealth without purpose was meaningless. Every dollar I spent was a vote for the kind of world I wanted to see, a world where the horrors I endured would become impossible. I am 70 years old now, in this year of 1890, and I find myself reflecting on 7 decades of an extraordinary, painful, triumphant life. I sit on the porch of the mansion that was once my prison, looking out over fields that enslaved people cultivated through suffering, and that free workers now tend with dignity. The transformation is real but incomplete, just as my personal journey from enslaved child to plantation owner is both miraculous and insufficient. Sykes Plantation continues to prosper under Samuel's management. He has expanded operations, purchasing 2 additional properties and increasing our total landholding to nearly 2,000 acres. He employs over 100 people, has established processing facilities to add value to our crops before sale, and has built business relationships extending from Virginia to markets in New York and Boston. His success exceeds even what I accomplished, proving that access to education and opportunity from childhood creates possibilities beyond what those of us who came to literacy and business late in life could achieve. My grandchildren are growing into remarkable young people. Charles, now 13, displays Samuel's intellectual gifts and Caroline's social conscience. His sisters, Ruth, named for my mentor, Margaret and Beverly, are equally talented, receiving educations that prepare them for whatever paths they choose. I tell them stories about their great-grandmother Ruth, about the people who survived slavery with their humanity intact, about the resistance and resilience that runs through their bloodline. I want them to know the full truth of our family history, not sanitized versions that erase the pain or the complexity. But the political and social situation continues to deteriorate. The brief flowering of Black political participation and economic advancement during Reconstruction is being systematically destroyed. Virginia and other southern states have enacted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other mechanisms designed to disenfranchise Black voters. Segregation is being codified into law, establishing a racial caste system that approximates slavery in everything but name. Lynching and racial terrorism are used to enforce white supremacy and punish Black success. The plantation has been targeted multiple times, crops destroyed, equipment sabotaged, workers threatened. We have armed guards and patrol the property nightly, living in a state of siege. Samuel argues that we should consider leaving Virginia, perhaps relocating to a northern city where racial hostility might be less extreme and legal protections more robust. It is a reasonable suggestion, and many successful Black families are making that choice. But I cannot bring myself to abandon this land. Too much blood has soaked into this soil, too many people sacrificed too much for me to claim it. Leaving feels like surrendering, like admitting that the forces of oppression have won. I know this is partly irrational, that strategic retreat can sometimes be the wisest choice, but my emotional connection to this place runs too deep. I have begun organizing my memoirs for publication, working with an editor from a Negro press in Washington to prepare the manuscript. The process of revisiting my experiences in detail has been emotionally exhausting. I have relived the trauma of being torn from my mother, the brutality of field labor, the violation by William Thornhill, the desperate years of maneuvering to protect myself and my son. But I have also reconnected with memories of resistance and solidarity, of people like Ruth who taught me to survive, of small victories that accumulated into transformation. The most difficult part has been writing about William Thornhill and Samuel's conception. How do I tell that story honestly without reducing my son to the product of violence? How do I acknowledge the horror of what was done to me while affirming the love I have for Samuel and his children? I have decided to present the facts directly, but to also make clear that Samuel transcends his origins, that he has made himself into a person of integrity and accomplishment, regardless of the circumstances of his birth. His existence is not a justification for the violence that created him, but neither is he diminished by it. My health is declining. I have developed heart problems that leave me exhausted and short of breath. The doctors say I should rest more, reduce stress, perhaps step back from active involvement in the plantation's operations, but I cannot seem to stop. Every moment of rest feels like wasted time, like an opportunity lost to secure the future, to build something that will outlast me. Caroline gently reminds me that I have already done more than anyone could reasonably expect, that it is acceptable to simply be rather than constantly doing. She is right, intellectually I know this, but emotionally I cannot accept it. I think often about what success actually means. By external measures, I have achieved something remarkable, transformed myself from enslaved property to wealthy landowner, built a prosperous enterprise, raised a family that has access to opportunities I could barely imagine. But the larger struggle for justice and equality remains unfinished, perhaps further from resolution now than it seemed 15 years ago during Reconstruction's hopeful years. What does my individual success mean in a society that is reimposing racial oppression through new mechanisms? Is my story evidence of possibility or an exceptional circumstance that proves nothing about systemic realities? I have decided that both can be true. My story is exceptional, shaped by specific circumstances and opportunities that most enslaved people never encountered. It does not prove that slavery was anything other than an abomination, nor does it suggest that the ongoing oppression of Black people is anything other than unjust. But it also demonstrates human capacity for resistance, strategic thinking, and transformation under even the most oppressive conditions. It shows that the narrative of Black inferiority was always a lie designed to justify exploitation. If my story can contribute to dismantling that lie, if it can inspire others to resist and to imagine possibilities beyond their current circumstances, then perhaps it serves a purpose beyond my personal satisfaction. Samuel and Caroline have promised to continue telling our family's story, to ensure that future generations understand where they came from and what was sacrificed to create their opportunities. They have committed to maintaining the plantation as a family enterprise, employing community members and contributing to collective advancement. They understand that wealth brings responsibility, that our success obligates us to fight for those still struggling under oppression's weight. As I sit here watching the sun set over fields that witnessed both my degradation and my triumph, I feel a complex mixture of emotions that cannot be reduced to simple categories. I feel pride in what I have built, grief for all those who did not survive to see freedom, anger at the injustices that continue, fear for my family's future in a hostile society, hope that the long arc of history will eventually bend toward justice. I feel the weight of 70 years, of 20 years in chains, and 50 years fighting for dignity and security. I feel tired, but also strangely at peace. I have lived a life that should have been impossible. I have transformed suffering into power, victimhood into agency, oppression into opportunity. I have done this not because I am exceptional, though perhaps I am, but because I refuse to accept the limits that others tried to impose on my humanity. I have done this because people like Ruth taught me to survive and resist, because Samuel gave me motivation beyond myself, because circumstances aligned in ways that allowed strategy to succeed where it usually fails. This is my story, told in my own words, preserved for whoever comes after. It is not a neat narrative with clear lessons or simple morality. It is messy, complicated, filled with pain and compromise and difficult choices. It is the truth of one woman's journey from slavery to ownership, from powerlessness to influence, from invisibility to voice. It is a testament to resilience, to the unbreakable human spirit, to the possibility of transformation even in the darkest circumstances. I am Beverly Sykes. I was enslaved for 20 years. I gave birth to my enslaver's son under circumstances of violence and coercion. I became the owner of the plantation that once owned me. I built a fortune from the ruins of a brutal system. I am a survivor, a mother, a businesswoman, a witness to history. This is my legacy, imperfect but real, offered to a future I will not live to see but helped to create. May those who come after remember the cost of freedom and never take it for granted. May they continue the fight for justice that my generation could not complete. May they build a world where stories like mine become impossible because the systems that created such suffering have been dismantled forever. Author's note: this narrative is based on the lived experiences of formerly enslaved people who navigated the brutal realities of American slavery and Reconstruction. While Beverly Sykes is a fictional character, her story reflects documented experiences of resistance, survival, and occasional economic advancement among Black Americans during this period. The historical record contains accounts of formerly enslaved people who became landowners, entrepreneurs, and community leaders despite facing systemic racism and violence. This story honors their resilience while acknowledging the ongoing struggle for racial justice that continues to this day.